Thanks, Michael. A pleasure to be here today, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, depending on when and where you are watching today's presentation, because I know many of you will be watching the recording and it might be any time of the day at all. As Michael has said, I want to talk about a lot of things around learnership today, but I want to make it about you. So I will be asking you to contribute in the chat box to give me your thoughts and ideas along the way. If you have got questions, please put them in the chat box, reactions, thoughts, ponderings, pop them all in there. As you see me occasionally look over here, that's when I'm looking at the chat box. So I'm not just sort of wandering off or anything, that's where the chat box is for me. Today, I want to talk about this idea of learnership because it struck me a while ago that we have been pouring a lot of resources into teacher professional learning. In Australia, where I'm based, we talk about the equality, the Australian standards for quality teachers. And around the world, there's this movement about making sure teachers are engaging in high quality, high impact teaching strategies. And it's all about what teachers do and what teachers do and what teachers do. We've been to professional learning that teaches us how to form carefully crafted formative feedback. And we're giving that to students, and we're setting appropriate learning goals and scaffolding learning. But have you ever noticed that for all the time and energy and resources you might put into forming that formative feedback for students, some of them just ignore it? Have you ever noticed that you set those carefully calibrated, stretched tasks for students, and then they say, "Can I have something easier, please?" Do you ever feel like you've got a classroom full of passive learners? Learners that's just sitting there going, "Make it happen, make it happen." And that you're dragging students through the learning process? I work with teachers all around the world, and those sort of feelings that we're constantly having to drag students through. I was reminded the other day of a little catchphrase that one of my early mentors taught me. She said, "James, never work harder than your students." And I just went, oh my God, I think pretty much every teacher I know works harder than their students. But she's right. We are skillful teachers. We're doing great work, but it's a two-way street here. And students have to hold up their end of the bargain. I was reading some work by John Holt. Some of you might know John Holt. John was, Michael jinxed me when he said I was great with the technology. John Holt, the American educator, many years ago now, did a lot of work in the homeschooling movement because he became disillusioned with the schooling process. But he's pointed out that learning is not the product of teaching. Learning is the product of the activity of learners. And at the end of the day, we can be the best teachers in the world. But if students aren't engaging in the process of learning themselves and doing it skillfully, then they're not going to learn anything. And it reminds me of this cartoon. Again, do you ever find these things sort of come back? They resonate with you at the time, and then later in life you go, that's why it resonated. I remember reading this cartoon years ago. I've taught my dog to whistle. That's great. But I don't hear him whistling. Well, I said I taught him. I didn't say he learnt anything. And that's what we mean when we talk about this idea that it's not just what the teachers do, it's how the students engage in this learning process. And what I want to talk to you today is about this concept of learnership. And when I think of learnership, I put this word together to put the words learning and craftsmanship together. I think of learning as a skillful process. And someone challenged me the other day. They said, "James, isn't learning innate? Don't we all sort of learn? You don't have to teach children to learn, they just learn." And I said, well, yeah, kind of. You don't have to teach children to move either. Like they'll get up and crawl and eventually they'll stand up and wobble around. We can all move and we can all learn. But in the same way, some of us learn to move with great precision, great grace, great power and accuracy, while others, like me, move through the world a little bit more clumsily. And it's that difference, the idea that learning can be done skillfully, done well, done more effectively, that I want to talk about. You know, when I talk about learnership, I want you to think about it in the same way as craftsmanship. That idea that there's a skillfulness developed over time. Think about the master craftsman. I remember my father, he's passed away now, but he was a GP, a doctor, but he was also a craftsman. He did a lot of woodwork and he would make grandfather clocks. And I would watch him as he was out in the garage building his clocks. And he'd select a piece of wood and he'd look at it from all angles and make sure it was straight. And then for no reason I could discern, decided that piece wasn't any good and would look at another piece and would get things exactly right. And it's that level of craftsmanship, that level of skillfulness, that level of passion and dedication that we're starting to talk about when we talk about this idea of learnership. And it's not just me that's talking about it. Some of the big corporate organisations are starting to recognise the importance of learning as a skill. McKinsey & Co are one of the big research and training organisations in the corporate world. And they put out a document a little while ago where they talked about learning itself is a skill and developing it is a critical driver of long-term career success. So if we want to have career success, being good at learning, not just being able to learn, but being good at learning is a critical factor. People who have mastered the mindsets and skills of effective learning can grow faster than their peers and gain more of the benefits from all the learning opportunities that come their way. In the same way, Harvard Business Review recently recognised the importance of learning as a skill. They said the similar sort of thing to McKinsey & Co, that a growing body of evidence is making it clear that learners are made, not born. I remember growing up at school and some people just, teachers, parents, adults, would tell me some kids just learn faster than others. Well, yeah, they do, but they don't just learn faster than others. They engage in the learning process more skillfully, more effectively, and as a result, learn faster than others. Through deliberate use of practice and dedicated strategies to improve our ability to learn, we can all develop expertise faster and more effectively. We can get better at getting better. And so there's clearly this need, both in schools, to alleviate this issue of teachers feeling like they're dragging students through the learning process, these passive, inactive learners. And in the corporate world, where we need to adjust and change and adapt more rapidly than ever, there's an increasing need to be skillful learners. I'm curious, and I would like you to put in the chat box, what are some of the words, some of the ideas that you think of when you think of this idea of craftsmanship? If you were to look at a craftsman in action, what words come to mind? So I'm curious as you drop those in the chat box. I know I was talking to a group the other day and we started talking about MasterChef. Do you have MasterChef, the TV show, or something similar to it? Ever seen a master chef at work? Compare a master chef to the way most people cook at home. That's the difference. What have we got here? Concentration, attention to detail, precision and creativity. These are all words that are associated with this idea of craftsmanship and should be associated with this idea of learnership. For me, it's a little bit, and here's some more finesse, what a great word that is. High standards, thorough, thoughtfulness, precision, sensitivity to their materials and tools. Oh, fantastic work. For me, it's the difference between a Timex and a Rolex. You know, some of us, a Timex will tell the time, for a while at least, But a Rolex was made with such precision, such care. It wasn't just slapped together. There was training and time it took to develop the skills to create it. Someone making a sculpture, that idea of, not me making a sculpture, but a craftsman making a sculpture. So let's flip that round. If this is what we see when we think about craftsmanship, what is it you're seeing in your students right now that makes you think, maybe they're not engaging in the learning process as well as perhaps they could? So again, what are some of the things that you see students doing that make you go, I don't know they're getting the most out of this lesson if they're going to behave like that? For me, and I wasn't a skillful learner as a student, I can tell you that. But one of the things I saw in my students early in teaching was that they knew that my lesson plan was sort of build the foundations, practice them, and get to the hard things at the end of the class. So some of my students would stretch out the time, never quite stopping, never like wasting their time so they'd get in trouble, but filling it up as best they could to avoid getting to the hard stuff at the end. Do you have kids to do that sort of stuff? What else do we see them? Lack of persistence when they come up against problems. They just either give up or they say, can you do it for me? What else have we got? All sorts of ideas that come up. Kids that dodge, can I have the easy questions, please? Tell me what to do. Distracting, putting up or noticing roadblocks. Yeah, just anything to avoid doing the difficult tasks. Anything to avoid getting judged or measured. You didn't make me learn that. What is it? Hello, I think. For those of you watching the recording, by all means put it in the chat. It's going to be just a little bit harder for me to respond to it in the moment though. No taking risks or learning. Yeah. We know the sorts of things that our students are doing. We've actually developed a tool. It's part of the work we're doing with Michael. We've actually developed a diagnostic to help us evaluate how skillfully students are engaging in the learning process. And as part of the program that we're going to invite you to have a look at after the webinar today, you'll be invited to participate in that Learnership Diagnostic Tool. And it's a fascinating insight into the actual learners that we have. Something to look forward to. We're still putting things up here. Not interested in all subjects, not taking the risk to learn. Oh, those kids that just go, I'll just show you what I can do over and over again without taking any risks. Yeah. A couple of months ago, I was asked by the Maths Association of Victoria to write an article about learnership. And so what I'd like to share with you now is this summary article. It's about 4 or 5 pages, covers the main ideas around learnership. And it's a great article. Michael will drop it into the chat box in just a moment. And if you're watching the recording, it'll be linked somewhere close. It's a great article to sort of cover off the main ideas and perhaps share with your colleagues that might want to know more about it. If you start talking about today's webinar and say, oh, this idea of learnership is really interesting, this would be a really good article just to go, here, have a look at this. This is kind of what it's about. Some of you might know me from my work with mindsets. I do a lot of work with schools about challenging teachers' mindsets and helping them change students' mindsets. And of course, this is Carol Dweck's work. And one of the things that I talk about when we talk about mindset is that it's not part of learnership, but it helps you develop learnership. Because one of the big misunderstandings about growth mindsets is that a growth mindset is not growth. When you look at Carol Dweck's book, and I've got a copy right here, when you look at Carol Dweck's book, you read through the first couple of chapters, and what you'll notice is that she lists all these people, world-class names you'd know people that have achieved extraordinary things with a growth mindset. And she lists all these other people, world-class, achieved extraordinary things with a fixed mindset. You see, you don't need a growth mindset to grow. It helps a lot, but you don't need it. All a growth mindset is an invitation to grow. It tells you, I can grow, but it doesn't tell you how. And so when we do this work with learnership, we start off by investigating this idea of developing a growth mindset, because fundamentally, someone with a fixed mindset sees the world like this. Someone with a fixed mindset says, hey, look at me. What you see, this is what you get. Person standing here today is pretty much the same person that's going to be standing here in 5 years' time, because this is just who I am. And when you see the world like that, you spend your life looking inwards, asking yourself, who am I? What abilities do I have? And as a result of discovering your abilities, you ask yourself, where do you fit in the world? Someone with a fixed mindset thinks that being comes before doing. They don't understand the learning process. They think learning is about discovering their abilities. And they'll say things to you like, do you think I'll be good at this? And when they ask you things like that, they're asking you to look inside them, tell them they've already got the abilities, and therefore take away any risk of failure. Whereas someone with a growth mindset says, hey, this is me today, but I change. Not just a little bit, I change a lot. I change some of my most basic characteristics, talents, abilities, intelligence. And when you see yourself like that, you don't spend your life looking inwards, asking, who am I? What abilities do I have? You spend your life looking outwards, saying, which abilities would I like? Do I choose to develop? Who do I want to become? Someone with a growth mindset understands that becoming comes before being. And they understand that learning is about creating your abilities. And once you understand that learning is about creating abilities that didn't previously exist, you're not trying to tap into them, you're not trying to unlock them, you're not trying to discover them. You're trying to build them and create them and generate them. Well, once you understand that, the next obvious question to ask is, how do I get really, really good at generating those new talents and abilities? And that's where learnership comes in. Once you understand you're capable of growth, learnership tells you how to achieve that growth. So the growth mindset, someone with a growth mindset understands themselves as a learner. Now, that was a 5-minute summary of a very, very big piece of work. And of course, it's not true to say people have fixed mindsets or growth mindsets. One of the things that we unlock in the Learnership masterclass that we're talking about here is we unlock this idea of the mindset continuum, to recognize that we're not fixed and we're not growth. And we talk about the strategies we use in classrooms to move students along that continuum. Because most of the research at the moment is showing that most school-based interventions around growth mindsets don't work. And the reason they don't work is because we've been busy teaching students about mindsets, telling them what they are, what they should say, what they do, when we should have been teaching for growth mindsets. Part of Carol Dweck's book here that I'll just leave you to ponder. This is something we address in the course. When you read Carol Dweck's book and you go through all her examples and you see how very, very important her work around mindset is, you don't always immediately recognise that not a single person in a book had read her book. Not a single one of her iconic examples had had a lesson about growth mindsets. No one had put up a poster that said, this is fixed, this is growth, do that. Where did they get their mindset from? And that's the sort of way we need to emulate if we're going to make a real impact on students' mindsets. But as I say, mindset is not a part of learnership, but it contributes to developing learnership. So when we talk about it in the course, we talk first about how we move students along that continuum and help them develop a more growth-orientated mindset so they will engage in the learning process in the first place. But we're here mainly to talk about this idea of learnership. And when I talk about engaging skillfully in the learning process, there are 5 elements, 5 attitudes towards these elements that we talk about that dictate how skillfully we engage in the learning process. Those 5 elements are around how you respond to challenge. And we've already seen in the chat box teachers talking about how students aren't taking on challenges, they don't want to take on risks. In a minute, I'll talk about how to encourage that, how to get them moving on that journey. How they develop their learning behaviours, I call habits of mind, based on Art Costa and Bennett Kalich's work. Sorry, I'm pausing there. I had the privilege today of joining Art Costa's 90th birthday party. It was an absolute thrill. He's been an icon of education, and it was such an enormous pleasure to be privileged to be invited to his birthday. So I'm feeling a bit chuffed about that today. How we gather information from mistakes and feedback. And we've already mentioned that some of our students just ignore their mistakes or avoid mistakes or don't listen to feedback. And we're going to talk about time and energy. And when we talk about time and energy, you might go, well, that's effort. Well, it's not really. It's not about the amount of time and energy students spend on learning. It's about how that time and energy is spent that's important. So let's go through this. While I'm doing it, Michael might drop in the learnership matrix, and you can sort of play along as you have a look at this as well. Let's have a look at this idea of challenge. Most learners learn like this. In the early part, it's pretty easy. Progress is quick, and then eventually you reach this part that Anders Ericsson describes as a learning plateau or a performance plateau. This area down here, where progress is quick, this is what we call our comfort zone. And our comfort zone is one of those things that everyone's heard about, but not many people actually understand. Because your learning zone is full of all those things that you've already mastered, things you've done in the past, things you know you can do well. But it's also full of what I call easy things you haven't done yet. All right, the world is full of easy things, things you're quite capable of doing that you just haven't got round to doing. For example, as I look across to the people with their cameras on, how many of you know your 13 times tables? Oh, Michael, my microphone's gone off. No one's put their hand up. None of you know your 13 times. Why would you? How many of you could know your 13 times tables by this time tomorrow? Yeah, all of you could do that. You've got the abilities. You've never had the need. If the need ever arose, you would be just looking at your calendar going, where have I got the time to do that? You'd be 100% certain that you could do it. It would just take time, and you'd be confident that after an hour or less that you'd be able to do it. And you'd know how you'd go about learning it. You'd write them out, you'd memorise them, you'd test them, you'd know them. Most people say that we've got to get outside your comfort zone. And they say to get outside your comfort zone, you need to do something new. The world is full of new things that are inside your comfort zone. To get outside your comfort zone means to go beyond your performance plateau, to do something more difficult than you've done before. But many of our students are trading the short-term gratification of doing something easy and immediate with the long-term benefit of struggling with something more challenging. This area up here, This is called your performance zone. And your performance zone is where you bring everything to bear, all your current abilities to produce your current peak performance. It takes all your concentration, all your focus. We can multitask, not well, but we can multitask because we've got extra cognitive resources. If you were learning your 13 times tables, you could cook dinner and have a conversation while you're doing it, but you can't multi-perform. Performance takes everything you've got. The trouble with your performance zone is that it's seductive. We like being in our performance zone, but we don't get better by doing our best. We get better by attempting a little bit beyond our best in what we call our learning zone. Now, you might have heard this called the zone of proximal development. Has anyone heard it called the zone of proximal development? It's exactly the same thing. I've just never seen a student proximately develop before. I've seen them learn, so I call it a learning zone. But in the learning zone, you're uncertain. You feel challenged. You're looking at the problem, you're going, I don't know how to do that. Maybe I'll be able to work it out, but I don't know. And most importantly, it's beyond your current abilities. That what got you here won't get you here. So you need to focus not just on what you're learning, but also how you're learning. And so one of the things that we talk about when we talk about developing learnership is helping students understand what each of these zones feel like. And it's important that we talk about what it feels like, not just understanding intellectually what they are. Because you only know when you're in different zones by the feelings it evokes. Like I said before, your comfort zone feels like a task. Your performance zone feels like performance. But this feels like a struggle. And so, with the group I was working with earlier this week, we were talking about how do you help students recognise when they're in the learning zone. And we talked about the idea that the answer's not immediately apparent. Unlike your 13 times tables, or unlike the performance that you put on in a classroom, you know how to do it. You're confident you know how to do it. When you're in your learning zone, you're going, don't know how to do it. Not sure about this. We feel a little bit stretched, but not strained. I like to think of it like an elastic band. When you're in your comfort zone, it's all loose. When you're in your learning zone, there's a bit of stretch in there, but it's not way beyond that. It's not strained where it's going to snap. I like to think of it this way, 7 out of 10 uncomfortable. When we look at our students in a classroom and ask them, how did you feel today? On a scale of 1 to 10, how uncomfortable did today's lesson make you feel? And if they go, oh no sir, it was pretty easy today, 3 out of 10, 4 out of 10, you go, oh, you've wasted your class. You've wasted your time. For the last 50 minutes, you've been in your comfort zone, and we don't get better in our comfort zone. You need to be feeling 7 out of 10 uncomfortable to be learning. We tend not to do that in the classroom. You should feel a little bit unsure, a little bit uncertain, but not completely lost. And importantly, it should be beyond your current abilities. When we talk about those ideas to help students recognise that growth, there is no growth without discomfort, that you're meant to feel a little bit uncomfortable when you're learning things. We get them used to that feeling of what they need to do, because some people take that feeling of discomfort as a sign of their limits. And as soon as they feel that discomfort, they back off and go back into their comfort zone, the things they know they can do well. Someone with a fixed mindset in particular does that. I was talking to a woman earlier this year who contacted me after a few years of work. I'd worked with her a few years ago. And she said, James, your workshop changed my life. Now, I'm not promising you I'm going to change my life or change your life. But I said, how? And she said, James, my whole life, whenever things got difficult, I stopped and I'd try something else. And as soon as that got hard, I'd stop. And as soon as the next thing got hard, I'd stop. And it wasn't until I did the work with you that I realized the difference between me and other people was that the other people just didn't stop. It wasn't any less uncomfortable for them, but they did it anyway. And the beautiful thing about it is that someone with a fixed mindset, this is why mindset plays into this all the time, says if it's hard now, the next step is going to be harder. The next step is going to be really hard. The step after that, why would I ever try to do things like that? Someone with a growth mindset that understands their learning zone says, yeah, this is uncomfortable, it's hard, until it's easy. And then this bit will be uncomfortable until it's easy. Then this bit will be uncomfortable until it's easy. And so as we help students understand their learning zone more thoroughly, they understand what the cost of growth is. It also helps us understand why challenges are different. And one of the models that I use in this book, this is one of my most recent books, The Learning Landscape. Some of you might use the model of the learning pit. I don't call it a learning pit, it's a challenge pit, because the pit represents the types of challenges. And challenges, things that you're asked to do, things that you're presented with, sometimes they're downhill challenges. You start here, but they're actually in your comfort zone, and where you've got to finish is downhill. Other challenges are performance challenges. That you start at the same level as you finish. Some, like the ones we've just been talking about, are learning challenges and stretch you, make you go uphill just a little bit. And some challenges are aspirational, that you can't climb up in one go. And when we start talking about the language of challenge, the language of learning zones, we help students understand and engage in the learning process. Now, clearly, what I've covered today in terms of challenges is just part of the issues. What we need to do is to develop a rich understanding of challenges. But we also need to go on and talk about the behaviours you need to engage in while you're taking on those challenges. The work of Art Costa and Bennett Kalick. What Art Costa and Bennett Kalick did was to essentially look at those highly successful people that were at the top of their game in lots of different fields, and said, what makes you so good? They documented through other people's research the behaviours they saw these people engaging in. And what the habits of mind are, and Michael's going to drop into the chat box, and again, if you're watching the recording, linked somewhere close to here, what Art Costa and Bennett Kalick identified were the dispositions that were skillfully and mindfully employed by characteristically successful people when they were in their learning zone. When the best were in the business of stretching and challenging themselves, the behaviours they called upon were these 16 habits of mind. And if you're not familiar with the habits of mind, have a look at the diagram here, download the PDF that Michael's dropped in the chat box, and have a think through, how are your students currently engaging in these behaviours? And as you do, reflect on that term that I just mentioned, skillfully and mindfully. Because when I said before that what got you here won't get you here, what you need to do to raise the bar, to do something more difficult than you've done before, is to develop, to extend, to build, mature your habits of mind. And that idea of how you go about getting better at persisting, getting better at managing your impulsivity, getting better at thinking flexibly or metacognition, are the sorts of ideas that we explore throughout the Learnership course that we're talking about today. And I am so thrilled. I mentioned Art Costa before. We have been working with Art Costa and Bennett Kalick over the last 18 months. Did anyone else find over the last 18 months plans, didn't quite go the way they thought? It was just me. I'm pretty sure we all did that. And I spent some of that time developing an assessment tool for the habits of mind. And one of the things that we'll explore in the Learnership course is how we map, how we take a snapshot of our students of habits of mind to find where their strengths are and find where their weaknesses are. And the beauty of this snapshot is it's not permanent. The habits of mind that are mapped on this profile, the orange ones, the ones that are the most well developed, are the ones that are in the student's comfort zone, the ones where they're already doing well. And what this signals to you when you've got these habits of mind in the orange zone is that you need to stretch and challenge yourself so there's more room to grow. We flipped the paradigm on assessment. We stopped asking how well developed are your habits of mind and asked instead, are your habits of mind well enough developed for the challenges you're currently facing? And if you get this type of profile with the orange, it means the challenges you're currently facing are in your comfort zone. And so depending on whether you're in your comfort, performance, learning zone, or this zone of concern, which is the red, we map out a plan of action to help students get better at these habits of mind. Really excited about the way we use this particular tool. I'm not sure why it's not going away though. Michael, you put the mozzer on me when you said before that was working well with the technology. Challenge, habits of mind. The next two elements of learnership are around mistakes and feedback. And I talk about them together because both mistakes and feedback are sources of information. They provide the information you need to move forward in your growth. There's a lot of talk about mistakes. I don't want to spend too much more of our time today talking about this, other than to say the work we're currently doing, if you're following social media, and if you're getting your teaching practice from social media, you might want to reflect on that. But social media will tell you mistakes are good, encourage mistakes, celebrate mistakes. Can you please stop doing that? Some of our students are becoming pilots and surgeons, and we don't want them making mistakes. What we've got to recognise is that mistakes are only as valuable as the information they give us. And we need to focus more on the student's actions rather than on the mistake. And in the work we do, we recognise that mistakes aren't one type of thing. There's actually 6 different types of mistakes. And learning to recognise the type of mistake we're making and how we should respond to it, like careless mistakes, sloppy mistakes, don't help us learn. And it's not all right when someone makes a critical mistake to say, it's all right, everyone makes mistakes, don't worry about it. Well, if that mistake was failing to put the wheels down on the plane, that's not okay. So we distinguish between different types of mistakes. If you want to know more about that, visit my website, jamesanderson.com.au, and do a Google for mistakes. I've got a series of blogs there about it as well. Curiously, about the feedback side of things, increasingly we're looking at the learner's role in feedback. And as I go through in just a moment the learnership matrix, I'll talk about how feedback should be started from the learner, not from the teacher. Finally, we talk about this idea of time and energy. And we talk about time and energy because most people have a skewed version of effort. They think effort is about doing more, longer hours, trying harder. And it's not about the amount of time and energy you spend, it's about how that time and energy is spent that's important. We explore this learnership matrix, not learnership matrix, the effective effort matrix that talks about how your time and energy is spent with your habits of mind and where your time and energy is spent in terms of below the bar in your comfort and performance zones or above the bar in your learning zone. And as a result, we identify 4 different types of effort. The sort of effort where you're cruising, doing it easy. Why is that? There we go, cruising, doing it easy. Or where you're performing and you should be doing your best. The sort of effort where you're struggling and you've got to go through that. Or the sort of effort where you're actually growing. And learning to distinguish, again, the subtleties between these and not talk about the amount of energy and time, but how that time and energy was spent and where in this matrix it is spent, allows us to develop a much richer conversation around effort. And eventually we'll talk about this idea of motivation calibration. Motivation calibration is this idea that McKinsey & Co., I mentioned before, researched using the PISA results in Africa and Europe. And what they discovered was that students who had a growth mindset, that responded to questions like, I can always improve, hard work pays off, those sorts of things, tended to do better than the kids that said, I've got my limits, there's not much I can do about it. The growth mindset made a difference. We knew that. But the better indicator of success was the students that could go on and not just say, I can grow, but could also go on and say, and this is how I will achieve the growth. And so this idea of motivation calibration is an understanding not only that you're capable of growth, but also how to accurately judge what actions will be required to achieve the growth. Because a lot of our students are miscalibrated. They vastly overestimate what it'll take to achieve the growth. And because they think the cost will be so high, they don't start. And once they know the type of actions, how to use their time and energy more effectively, and can more accurately judge what it will take to achieve their growth, the research out of McKinsey & Co. suggests that that understanding accounts for up to 2 years' worth of growth. Quite extraordinary. The students that were well calibrated compared to the students that weren't. If you've got questions that are coming up, make sure you chuck them in the chat box. I'm glancing over every now and then. I don't think I've missed any, but if they're coming up, put them in there. Because now I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so going through these 6 different types of learners. Now that we understand a little bit about what challenge means, what habits of mind are, to think about mistakes and feedback as sources of information, and effort as how we spend our time and energy, we can identify 6 different types of learners based on their attitudes and responses to those 5 characteristics. So let me just turn a little bit of my technology around here and then do this, and then I'll pop in here for you. There you go. And I'll even get out of your way. Are non-learners. Now, I don't think we've got a lot of non-learners, but this is a baseline. This is someone who doesn't participate in the learning process at all. Michael, if you wanted to drop, if you haven't already, the learnership matrix so people can see this in case it's not clear on the screen. Someone with a non-learner is someone who will avoid a challenge. They will rather do nothing than something. If you offer them options A, B, and C, they'll ask you, do I have to do this? These are the students who are ignorant of their habits of mind. They have no language, no way to describe how they engage in the learning process because they typically avoid the learning process altogether. Excuse me. They will ignore mistakes, don't even know it's right or wrong, just ignore them altogether. And in the same way, they'll disregard your feedback, won't even look at it in the first place. And their time and energy is largely wasted. They're doing nothing productive. As I said, I don't think we have a lot of these learners, but this is opting out of the learning process altogether. And as I go up, I'd be curious to hear, where do you start recognizing your learners? These are the learners, these beginning learners, are the learners that reduce challenges. They want to take the path of least resistance. If you give them options A, B, and C, they'll say, Can I have option D? Is there an easier option, please? Like, they're prepared to do things, they're active in that way, but they want the minimum possible out of it. They can describe their learning behaviours, but only reflectively. Only after they've engaged in the learning process. There's no forethought, there's no planning, there's no selection of strategies. They will say, oh, in that lesson I had to ask a question and I had to get to, keep going when I got stuck. But that's it. They can recognise mistakes. I got it wrong. But they don't act on that information. They will acknowledge your feedback. Thank you. But again, they don't act on the feedback. Learning stops when they're finished. And they spend their time doing. They're busy sometimes in class. They can produce things. And the work they're doing is just filling up the time. Sometimes when we talk about this in the Learnership course, we talk about how different learners build different cultures, or different cultures breed different learners. And this sort of learner breeds a culture of activity, which is really good if you run an after school care centre, but not great if you're in a classroom. Performance learners want to show you their best. These are the learners that are reducing their challenges, limiting their challenges to their best. Excuse me. They're very happy to show you what they can do. Ta-da, ta-da, look what I can do. They're always showing you their best work, their perfect work, without ever taking the risk of going beyond. They can apply their habits of mind, their learning behaviours, because they've applied them before. They know what they have to do to reach this standard. They've reached that standard 50 other times and will tell you exactly what they need to do again. They avoid mistakes by staying in their learning zone, staying in their performance zone, beg your pardon, and they select feedback. And when I say they select feedback, they're very happy to listen to the positive affirmations. They're the students that go, oh, thank you, you said I did that well, I'm doing this really well, I've got that right, and they're all shiny and happy. But then they ignore the, I think you can do this better, here's how you can improve. And they spend their time performing, getting things done. All three of these learners are what I call below the bar learners. They're not actually growing significantly at all. Our directed learners are compliant learners. These are the learners that do what they're told, and their key characteristic is that they rely on the teacher to guide them through the learning process. They will attempt challenges that you give them. They will extend the habits of mind that you show them how to do. If you need to check your work, this is how you do it. They correct mistakes when you show them how it's done. They respond to feedback that you give them. And they spend their time producing. They can occasionally produce really good results. And I've worked with some schools that have built this teaching culture. It's all about teachers do the hard work, teachers show students what to do, teachers. Every conversation is about teaching. And students do what they're told. And occasionally you can get great results until the teacher's not there anymore and the students have no idea how to engage in the learning process on their own. Independent learners, self-directed learners, these are the learners that are in charge of the learning process. These are the learners who understand how to go into their learning zone. They're comfortable with that. They target their own challenges. They develop their own habits of mind, knowing what they need to do to get to their goal. They use their mistakes. They request feedback. They're looking for that information and they spend their time striving, pushing themselves forward. And you'd reckon that would be a pretty good outcome and I could stop here. But I think we not only want to do better, but need to do better. Our Agile learner is someone who embraces challenges. And they embrace challenges in the spirit of JFK, We do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. These are the people that when they're offered 4 or 5 challenges, they go, which one's going to stretch me the most? Which one is the one that's going to help me develop, cultivate my habits of mind, to build on the areas that I currently am not strong in? Whereas this strength-based approach we often take at the moment is about, well, you're strong at this, I'm strong at this, so I'll do this bit, you do that bit. This person will say, well, you're strong at this, I'm weak at that, can I work with you so I can get strong at it? So they're looking to cultivate those behaviours. They design mistakes. They create environments to give them the information they need to grow. They think like a scientist, whereas the independent learner acts like an autopsy, digs into the mistake to find out why. The Agile learner works like a black box recorder, making sure everything they need is being collected. And in the same way, they tailor feedback. Tailoring feedback, have you ever gone up to someone for feedback and said, what did you think? Can you tell me how to do this? And they went, no, I wasn't really paying attention, sorry. An Agile learner will come up to you before the performance and say, can you watch this thing that I'm doing so you can give me the feedback that I need? One of the schools I work with in Sydney is now giving students the assignment sheet for their projects and things like that gets handed back with the assignment, and the students have to say what the focus of their learning has been, where they have struggled, and what feedback they need from the teacher. And so the teacher gets the assignment and goes, right, James needs to know about this. I'll give him the information about that. They're free to add anything else, of course, but they're making sure they're giving exactly the information the student needs. And these students spend their time growing. Now, I'm very conscious of the time, and I'm also conscious that a question's popped up here. The idea here, as you've listened to those different learners and had them described to you, where do you find your learners? A lot of the schools I work with tell me they've got a lot of beginning learners, a lot of performance learners, and some directed learners. Depends on the school where they are. Not a lot of independent, and very rarely do we have any Agile learners. And using this diagnostic tool that I talked about earlier, we can assess where your learners are, and we nearly always get a bell curve, nearly always, and it'll be centered over that beginning performance or directed learner. And the question is, if you came to this course and we could shift all those learners across 1 notch, maybe 1.5 notches, how much better would your classroom environment be? How much less energy would you need to put into teaching as students started taking control of the learning process? Remembering what I said before about never work harder than your students, how much closer to that would you get?